You don't belong here. The words slice through the first-class cabin like a blade, sharp and certain. Every head turns. A black man in jeans and a hoodie stands frozen at row 3, boarding pass in hand, while flight attendant Lauren Hale blocks the aisle with her body and her judgment. Her voice carries, loud enough for the entire section to hear, designed to humiliate. Passengers shift uncomfortably. A few phones lift, recording. The man doesn't argue, doesn't shout. He simply waits, and somehow that silence feels more threatening than any outburst. What Lauren doesn't know, what nobody on Flight 2847 knows, is that this confrontation isn't random. It's a test, and she's failing it on camera. If you're drawn to stories where one moment of courage exposes an entire system, stay with me until the end. Like and comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Boeing 787 sat gleaming on the tarmac at LaGuardia, its engines humming low as the last passengers trickled through the jetway. Inside, the first-class cabin was a bubble of muted luxury. Cream leather seats, ambient lighting, the faint scent of citrus from the pre-flight towel service. Flight attendant Lauren Hale moved through the aisle with practiced efficiency, her blonde hair pulled into a flawless bun, her smile calibrated for the wealthy clientele who populated rows 1 through 5. Lauren had worked this route for 6 years. New York to Los Angeles. The red eye. She knew the rhythm of it. The tech executives who'd sleep before takeoff, the minor celebrities who'd want champagne and attention, the Wall Street types who'd bark orders and expect miracles. She'd learned to read passengers in seconds. Designer luggage meant deference. Nervous energy meant hand-holding, and anything that didn't fit the profile meant trouble. She was closing the overhead bin in row 2 when she saw him. A black man in his mid-30s, wearing dark jeans, white sneakers, and a gray hoodie with the hood down. No suit jacket, no leather briefcase, just a worn backpack slung over one shoulder and a phone in his hand. He was tall, easily 6'2", with close-cropped hair and dark, intelligent eyes that scanned the cabin as he walked down the aisle, toward first class. Lauren's smile tightened. She watched him approach row 3, watched him glance at his boarding pass, watched him reach for the overhead bin. "Excuse me." Her voice was polite but firm. She stepped into the aisle, positioning herself between him and the seat. "Can I see your boarding pass?" The man paused. He looked at her, not with anger, not with confusion, but with a kind of measured patience that somehow made her more uneasy. "Of course." His voice was deep, calm, almost gentle. He handed her the boarding pass without protest. Lauren scanned it. Seat 3A, first class. Her eyes flicked to the name printed at the top. Evan Carter. She looked him up and down again. The sneakers. The hoodie. The backpack that looked like it had survived a decade of use. "I think there's been a mistake," she said, handing the pass back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is first class. You probably meant to go to the main cabin. It's through that curtain." Evan didn't move. He glanced at the boarding pass in his hand, then back at her. "No mistake," he said quietly. "That's my seat." Lauren's jaw tightened. Around them, other passengers were starting to notice. A man in row 1, silver-haired, wearing a Rolex the size of a small planet, looked up from his phone. A woman across the aisle lowered her magazine. "Sir," Lauren's voice was louder now, performative. "I need you to show me your actual boarding pass. This ticket is mine," Evan interrupted, his tone still calm but now edged with something harder. "Seat 3A, first class. Paid for in full." Lauren felt heat rising in her chest. She'd dealt with people trying to sneak into first class before. Economy passengers who thought they could bluff their way into an upgrade. Gate agents who made errors. Confused travelers who couldn't read their own tickets. But this man wasn't confused. He was defiant. And worse, he was making a scene. "I'm going to need you to step back into the jetway," she said, her voice sharp now, her smile gone. "We can sort this out with the gate agent." Evan didn't move. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out his phone. "I'd like to call customer service," he said. Lauren's face flushed. "Sir, you can't just—" "I'm a paying passenger," Evan said, his voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "I have a valid boarding pass. I'm in my assigned seat." If there's a problem, I'd like to speak with someone who can resolve it." The cabin had gone completely silent. Every passenger in first class was watching now. A young woman in row 4 had her phone out, the camera pointed directly at them. The man in row 1 was leaning forward, his expression hovering between discomfort and curiosity. Lauren felt the eyes on her, felt the pressure. She'd been trained for difficult passengers, for medical emergencies, for evacuations. But not for this. Not for someone who wasn't yelling, wasn't threatening, wasn't giving her anything she could point to and say, "See? He's the problem." "Sir," she said again, her voice rising, "if you don't step back right now, I'm going to have to call security." Evan's expression didn't change. He simply looked at her, patient, unreadable, and said, "Then call them." The supervisor's name was Martin Cross, and he arrived 3 minutes later, slightly breathless, his tie askew. He was a thin man in his 50s with thinning hair and the perpetually harried look of someone who'd spent his career managing crises he didn't create. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between Lauren and Evan. Lauren jumped in before Evan could speak. "This passenger is in the wrong section. He has a boarding pass for first class, but I believe there's been an error. He's refusing to move." Martin looked at Evan, took in the hoodie, the jeans, the backpack. His eyes flicked to the boarding pass in Evan's hand. "May I see that?" Evan handed it over without a word. Martin scanned it. His frown deepened. He pulled out his tablet, tapped a few times, pulled up the flight manifest. The silence stretched. "This is correct," Martin said slowly. He looked up at Evan, then at Lauren. "Seat 3A, first class, purchased 3 weeks ago, confirmed." Lauren's face went pale, then red. But nothing," Martin said quietly, though his voice carried a warning. He turned to Evan. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Carter. Your seat is absolutely correct. Please, make yourself comfortable." Evan nodded once, his face unreadable. He moved past Lauren, who stood frozen in the aisle, and sat down in 3A, placing his backpack under the seat in front of him. Martin turned to Lauren, his voice low but sharp. "A word. Now." They moved to the galley, just out of earshot of the passengers, though not out of sight. Lauren could feel the eyes on her back, could feel the heat of humiliation crawling up her neck. "What the hell was that?" Martin hissed. "I was just—" Lauren started, her voice defensive. "He didn't look like he belonged in first class. I thought—" "You thought what?" Martin's voice was ice. "That you could racially profile a passenger in front of a dozen witnesses, half of whom are probably recording this on their phones right now?" "I didn't—" Lauren's voice cracked. "It wasn't about that. He was wearing a hoodie. He had a backpack. I've seen people try to sneak into first class before, and you've also seen plenty of people in hoodies and backpacks who did belong there," Martin snapped. "Tech executives, students, athletes. You know damn well what this looks like." Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she'd been doing her job, that she'd been protecting the integrity of the cabin, that this had nothing to do with race. But the words wouldn't come, because she knew, somewhere deep down in a place she didn't want to examine, that if Evan had been white, if he'd been wearing the same hoodie and jeans but had lighter skin and different features, she might have asked to see his boarding pass. But she wouldn't have made a scene. She wouldn't have threatened to call security. She wouldn't have assumed, so quickly and so absolutely, that he didn't belong. "Get back to your station," Martin said, his voice flat, "and pray to God this doesn't end up on the news." Lauren returned to the cabin, her hands shaking slightly as she resumed her pre-flight duties. She avoided looking at Evan, avoided looking at the passengers who were still whispering, still stealing glances at the man in 3A. But she could feel it, the shift in the air, the way the cabin had turned against her. A passenger in row 2, an older white woman with glasses and a paperback, caught Lauren's eye as she passed. "That was disgraceful," the woman said quietly. Lauren flinched but said nothing. In row 4, the young woman who'd been recording put her phone away, but not before Lauren saw her typing furiously, probably posting the video, probably adding hashtags, probably ensuring that this moment would live forever on the internet. And in 3A, Evan Carter sat in silence, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed as if meditating. But Lauren noticed something. His phone was on the armrest, screen up, and on the screen was a paused video, timestamp visible, angle clear. He'd recorded the entire thing. The flight was delayed. Not because of the confrontation, at least not officially. The gate agent cited mechanical checks, but the passengers knew better. The whispers had spread from first class to the main cabin, fueled by social media posts and hurried text messages. By the time the plane finally pushed back from the gate, 40 minutes late, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own. Lauren moved through the cabin, her smile mechanical, her hands cold. She offered drinks, collected trash, made the standard announcements. But the entire time she could feel the weight of Evan's presence in 3A. He didn't speak to her, didn't look at her, didn't ask for anything. He just sat there, calm and still, like a man waiting for something. And somehow, that was worse than any confrontation. Evan Carter had been many things in his life: the son of a Detroit auto worker and a public school librarian, a scholarship student at Stanford, a software engineer who'd climbed the ranks at 3 different companies before founding his own. And now, at 36, the CEO of Carter Analytics, a data consulting firm that specialized in algorithmic bias detection and corporate accountability audits. His company had worked with hospitals to identify racial disparities in patient care, with police departments to analyze stop and frisk data, with tech giants to root out discrimination in hiring algorithms. And 6 months ago, they'd been contracted by Vanguard Airlines, the parent company of the very airline he was currently flying, to conduct a comprehensive audit of customer service practices, employee training protocols, and discrimination complaints. The contract was worth $4.2 million. It was also confidential. Vanguard's board had been spooked by a series of viral incidents, passengers removed from flights, complaints of racial profiling, lawsuits alleging discriminatory treatment. They wanted answers, they wanted data, and they wanted plausible deniability if the findings were damning. So they'd hired Evan. The audit had been underway for 3 months. Evan's team had reviewed thousands of incident reports, analyzed complaint patterns, interviewed employees and passengers. They'd identified troubling trends. Black passengers were 3.7 times more likely to be questioned about their tickets, 2.4 times more likely to be asked to move seats, and 5.1 times more likely to be removed from flights compared to white passengers with identical booking profiles. But data was one thing. Experience was another. Evan had wanted to see it for himself, to test the system from the inside. So he'd booked a first-class ticket under his own name, no corporate account, no special treatment, and dressed exactly as he would for a casual weekend trip. He hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. He hadn't expected Lauren Hale to be so blatant, but he'd been ready. The recording on his phone was time-stamped, geotagged, and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. His lawyer had a copy. His lead analyst had a copy. And his contact at Vanguard's corporate office, a woman named Sandra Yates, who served as the company's chief diversity officer and had secretly greenlit this entire operation, had a copy. This wasn't just about Lauren. It was about the system that trained her, promoted her, and protected her. And now, Evan had proof. The flight leveled off at 35,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed, passengers reclined their seats, pulled out laptops, opened books. In 3A, Evan finally opened his eyes. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a tablet. On the screen was a spreadsheet, rows and rows of data, color-coded and annotated. Flight numbers, dates, employee names, incident types. He scrolled to the bottom and added a new entry. Flight 2847, LaGuardia to LAX. Employee, Lauren Hale. Incident, boarding pass challenged. Threat of security removal. Duration, 8 minutes. Witnesses, 12 plus. Video evidence, yes. He saved the file. Then he opened his email and typed a message to Sandra Yates. Subject, Phase 2. Complete Sandra. Incident occurred as anticipated. Video evidence attached. Employee exhibited clear pattern consistent with findings in Phase 1 data. Recommend immediate review and comparison with prior complaints involving same employee. Will provide full debrief upon arrival. EC, he hit send. Then he reclined his seat, closed his eyes, and waited. 3 rows behind him, in seat 6C, a passenger named Marcus Green watched Evan with quiet admiration. Marcus was a civil rights attorney from Brooklyn. and he'd seen the entire confrontation. He'd wanted to intervene, wanted to stand up and say something, but he'd hesitated, unsure if his involvement would help or escalate things. Now, watching Evan sit in calm silence, Marcus felt a pang of guilt. And something else. Respect. He didn't know who Evan Carter was, didn't know what he did, why he'd stayed so composed, why he'd seemed almost prepared for Lauren's hostility. But Marcus knew one thing. Whatever was coming next, Lauren Hale had no idea what she'd just walked into. In the galley, Lauren stood alone, staring at her reflection in the polished steel of the coffee maker. Her hands were still shaking. She told herself she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd been following protocol, that anyone in her position would have questioned a passenger who didn't fit the profile. But the words felt hollow. She thought about the woman in row 2. Disgraceful. She thought about the phones, the cameras, the video that was probably already circulating online. She thought about Evan Carter, sitting in 3A, silent and still. And for the first time in her 6-year career, Lauren Hale felt afraid. Not of losing her job, not of bad press, but of something deeper. The fear that she'd been seen, truly seen, for exactly who she was, and that there would be consequences. The flight continued west, slicing through the darkness over Pennsylvania, then Ohio, then the Great Plains. In first class, the passengers settled into the rhythm of a red-eye flight, some sleeping, some working, some watching movies on seatback screens. But in 3A, Evan Carter remained awake. His eyes were closed, but his mind was sharp, running through the next steps. The data was solid. The video was clear. The pattern was undeniable. But this wasn't just about exposing one flight attendant. It was about forcing Vanguard Airlines to confront a truth they'd been avoiding for years. That their training failed, that their policies enabled bias, that their culture allowed people like Lauren Hale to thrive, and that until they addressed it, publicly, transparently, with real accountability, nothing would change. Evan had built his career on this work, on shining light into systems designed to hide their own failures. And tonight, on Flight 2847, he'd just added one more piece of evidence to a case that was about to reshape an entire industry. The plane banked slightly, adjusting course. Evan opened his eyes and looked out the window at the darkness below. Somewhere down there, in cities and towns scattered across the country, people were boarding planes, checking into hotels, walking into offices, and some of them, too many of them, were being judged, questioned, and dismissed because of the color of their skin. Evan had spent years documenting it, quantifying it, proving it. But tonight, he'd lived it, and that made all the difference. The seatbelt sign chimed off. Evan reached for his tablet again. There was work to do, and this flight was just the beginning. The coffee service began an hour into the flight, and Lauren forced herself to go through the motions. She pushed the cart down the aisle with mechanical precision, her smile painted on, her voice hitting all the right notes of professional warmth. But inside, her thoughts were spinning, colliding, fragmenting into 1,000 anxious pieces. When she reached row 3, she paused. Evan was awake, his tablet balanced on the tray table, his fingers moving across the screen with focused intensity. He didn't look up as she approached. Coffee? Tea? Lauren's voice came out steadier than she felt. Evan glanced up. For a moment their eyes met, and Lauren felt something shift in her chest. A flicker of something that might have been shame, might have been defiance, might have been the desperate hope that this man would somehow forget what had happened, that the entire incident would dissolve into the background noise of travel inconveniences. Black coffee, please, Evan said. His voice was polite, neutral. Nothing in his tone suggested anger or accusation. Somehow, that made it worse. Lauren poured the coffee with hands that trembled just slightly. She set the cup on his tray table, and as she did, she caught a glimpse of his tablet screen. Rows of data, names, flight numbers, dates, her name. Employee, Lauren Hale. The words were right there, highlighted in yellow, part of a spreadsheet that seemed to contain dozens of similar entries. Lauren's breath caught. She looked away quickly, but not before Evan noticed her reaction. His expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Acknowledgement, maybe. Or calculation. Thank you, he said, reaching for the coffee. Lauren moved on to the next row, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Who was this man? Why did he have her name in a database? Was he a journalist, a lawyer, some kind of investigator? The coffee cart suddenly felt too heavy, the aisle too narrow, the cabin too small. Behind her, she heard the soft chime of a phone notification. Then another, and another. In row 4, the young woman who'd recorded the confrontation was staring at her phone, her eyes wide. She showed the screen to her seatmate, a man in his 20s with headphones around his neck. He looked at the phone, then up at Lauren, then back at the phone. "Holy shit," he muttered. The woman nodded, her fingers flying across the screen. Lauren's stomach dropped. She abandoned the coffee cart in the galley and pulled out her own phone, her hands shaking as she opened Twitter. The video was everywhere. Not just on one account, but dozens. Hundreds. The young woman from row 4 had posted it first, but it had been retweeted, quoted, shared, reposted across every platform. The hashtag seat in first KMO class was already trending. Lauren watched herself on the screen, watched her face twist with irritation, watched herself block Evan from his seat, watched herself threaten to call security. The video had been edited with subtitles, with reaction GIFs, with commentary from users who were equal parts outraged and unsurprised. This is what racism looks like in 2025. She really said he didn't look like he belonged there? Name the airline, name the employee. We need accountability. I hope she loses her job. Lauren's vision blurred. She scrolled through the comments, each one a knife twist. Some were calling for her termination. Others were digging into her background, trying to identify the airline, the flight number, her full name. One user had already found her Facebook profile. It was set to private, but her profile picture was visible, and someone had screenshot it and posted it alongside the video with the caption, "Found her." Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate. "Laura, are you okay? You're all over Twitter." Then another from her sister. "What the hell happened? Mom's freaking out. Call me." Then one from a number she didn't recognize. "You're a disgrace to the uniform. Racist bitch." Lauren's hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She shoved it into her pocket and looked up to find Martin standing in the galley entrance, his face grim. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Now." They stepped into the rear galley, away from the passengers. Martin closed the curtain and turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's online," he said. It wasn't a question. Lauren nodded, her throat tight. "Corporate's already called," Martin continued. His voice was flat, professional, but there was an edge to it that Lauren had never heard before. "Twice. They're monitoring the situation. They want a full incident report from both of us before we land." "I didn't," Lauren started, but Martin held up a hand. "Don't. Whatever you're about to say, don't." He rubbed his face, suddenly looking every one of his 56 years. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand the position you've put this airline in?" "I was doing my job," Lauren said, her voice rising despite herself. "I've questioned passengers before. I've asked to see boarding passes. That's part of the protocol." "The protocol," Martin interrupted, his voice sharp now, "is to verify tickets when there's a legitimate reason for concern, not to single out a passenger because he's black and wearing casual clothes." "That's not," Lauren's voice cracked. "That's not what happened." "Then what did happen?" Martin demanded. "Because from where I'm standing and from what half the internet is saying, it looks exactly like racial profiling." Lauren opened her mouth, then closed it. She wanted to explain, to justify, to make him understand that it hadn't been about race, that she'd genuinely thought there was a mistake, that she'd been trying to maintain order in her cabin. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, she knew Martin was right. "I need you to finish this flight," Martin said, his tone softer now, but no less serious. "I need you to be professional, courteous, and invisible. Don't engage with that passenger again unless he requests something. Don't talk to the other passengers about what happened. And for God's sake, don't post anything on social media." Lauren nodded numbly. "When we land, you're going straight to the crew office. No exceptions. HR will be waiting." Martin paused, his expression almost pitying. "I'm sorry, Lauren. but this is out of my hands now." He left her standing alone in the galley, the curtain swaying in his wake. Lauren sank onto the jump seat, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. She pulled out her phone again and opened Twitter, scrolling through the endless stream of outrage. The video had been viewed over 2 million times. 2 million people watching her worst moment, judging her, condemning her, sharing her face and her failure across the digital landscape. She thought about her career, 6 years of early mornings and late nights, of smile through anything customer service, of seniority slowly accumulating, of dreams about international routes and better pay, and maybe, someday, a transfer to corporate training. All of it was crumbling. And the man in seat 3A, the man she'd humiliated, the man she'd threatened, was sitting 30 feet away, calm and silent, watching it all unfold, watching her destroy herself. Lauren closed her eyes and tried to breathe. The flight stretched ahead of her like a prison sentence. 3 more hours trapped in this aluminum tube, with witnesses to her shame, with cameras ready to capture her next mistake, with a future that suddenly felt terrifyingly uncertain. She'd spent 6 years believing she was good at her job. Now she wasn't sure she'd ever understood what that job actually required. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Lauren gripped the armrest of the jump seat, her knuckles white. Outside, beyond the walls of the cabin, the night rushed past at 500 miles per hour. But inside, time had slowed to a crawl, and every second felt like drowning. In seat 3A, Evan closed his tablet and leaned back, his coffee cooling on the tray table beside him. He'd felt Lauren's eyes on his screen, had seen the recognition dawn on her face when she'd glimpsed her name in the database. He hadn't meant for her to see it, not yet, but perhaps it didn't matter. The mechanism was already in motion. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Sandra Yates. "Video is everywhere. Board is an emergency session. They want to move up the timeline. Can you deliver preliminary findings by tomorrow afternoon?" Evan typed back quickly. "Yes, we'll have full documentation ready by 2 p.m. Pacific." "Good. This is bigger than we thought. Press is already calling. We need to get ahead of it." Evan put the phone down and stared out the window at the darkness. Below, somewhere in the invisible landscape, cities glowed like scattered embers. People were waking up, checking their phones, seeing the video, forming opinions, choosing sides. The story was writing itself now, propelled by the viral momentum of social media and the magnetic pull of injustice caught on camera. But Evan knew something the online mob didn't. This wasn't just about Lauren Hale. She was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was systemic, embedded in training protocols that taught employees to trust their instincts without questioning their biases, in complaint procedures that protected the airline more than the passengers, in a corporate culture that valued efficiency over equity and profit over dignity. Lauren had failed tonight, but the system had failed long before she ever blocked his path. Evan had spent 3 months documenting that failure. He had incident reports dating back 5 years. He had complaint patterns that showed certain routes, certain crews, certain hubs were hotbeds of discriminatory behavior. He had testimony from passengers who'd been questioned, moved, removed, or banned, disproportionately black, disproportionately young, disproportionately working class. And now he had video evidence of exactly how it happened in real time. The data was damning, but data alone didn't change systems. Public pressure did, accountability did, consequences did. Evan opened his tablet again and began drafting his preliminary report. His fingers moved quickly across the screen, translating 3 months of research into clear, concise findings designed to leave no room for denial or deflection. Preliminary findings: Vanguard Airlines Discrimination Automation Audit. Executive Summary: Analysis of 847 incident reports from January 2023 to December 2024 reveals statistically significant patterns of discriminatory treatment toward passengers of color, particularly black passengers, across multiple service touchpoints, including boarding, seating verification, and removal procedures. He wrote for 30 minutes, constructing the framework of accountability. Behind him, the cabin was quiet. Most passengers asleep or absorbed in their own worlds. But Evan could feel the tension still hanging in the air, the awareness that something had shifted, that this flight had become more than just a journey from one coast to another. It had become evidence. Marcus Green couldn't sleep. He lay in seat 6C with his eyes closed, but his mind was racing, turning over the confrontation he'd witnessed, The implications it carried, the familiar ache of recognition that came from seeing his own experiences reflected in someone else's humiliation. Marcus had been practicing civil rights law for 12 years. He'd represented plaintiffs in employment discrimination cases, housing discrimination cases, police misconduct cases. He'd seen the patterns, documented the data, argued before judges who sometimes listened and sometimes didn't. But lately he'd been feeling the weight of it, the exhaustion that came from fighting the same battles over and over, from watching viral videos of injustice generate outrage that lasted a week before fading into the noise of the next crisis. Change felt slow, glacial, sometimes impossible. And yet, watching Evan Carter tonight, watching him remain calm in the face of Lauren's hostility, watching him refuse to shrink or apologize or make himself smaller to accommodate her prejudice, Marcus had felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. A reminder that resistance didn't always look like confrontation, that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to stand your ground and refuse to accept someone else's diminished vision of who you were allowed to be. Marcus opened his eyes and looked toward the front of the cabin, toward the back of Evan's seat. He didn't know who this man was, but he wanted to. He pulled out his phone and opened Twitter, scrolling through the flood of responses to the video. The outrage was predictable, but mixed in with the anger were other voices. People sharing their own stories of being profiled on planes, in hotels, in stores. Black professionals recounting the exhausting ritual of code switching and credential flashing just to be treated with basic respect. Parents talking about explaining to their children why they might be treated differently, might be questioned more, might have to work twice as hard to be seen as belonging. The thread stretched on, a digital tapestry of accumulated indignity. Marcus added his own tweet. I was on this flight. I watched this happen in real time, and I did nothing. That silence, my silence, is part of the problem too. We all have to do better. Seat in first class. He hit send and put the phone away. Then he closed his eyes again and tried to find sleep in the turbulent space between guilt and determination. 3 rows ahead, in seat 3D, a woman named Angela Park had been watching the fallout on her laptop. She was a tech journalist for Wired, heading home to San Francisco after a conference in New York, and her editor had already texted her twice asking if she could get an interview with the passenger from the video. Angela had ignored the texts. She'd spent the last hour doing something else, researching Evan Carter. It hadn't been hard. A quick LinkedIn search had revealed his company, his credentials, his professional focus, Carter Analytics, algorithmic bias detection, corporate accountability audits. And then, digging deeper, she'd found a mention in Vanguard Airlines' last quarterly earnings call, a footnote in the CEO's remarks about ongoing initiatives to enhance customer service protocols and equity measures. The pieces clicked together. Angela opened a new document and started typing. Headline: The passenger who was ready. When Evan Carter boarded Flight 2847 from New York to Los Angeles last night, he wasn't just another traveler hoping for an uneventful journey. He was conducting a test, and Vanguard Airlines failed it spectacularly. She wrote quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard, constructing a narrative that went beyond the viral video, beyond the surface outrage, into the deeper story of how discrimination persisted in systems designed to appear neutral, how companies hired consultants to audit their practices only when the threat of public exposure or legal liability forced their hand. This wasn't just about one flight attendant making a racist assumption. This was about an entire industry that had been given chance after chance to address discrimination and had chosen, repeatedly, to prioritize optics over action. Angela had covered enough tech scandals to recognize the pattern. The think pieces and the promises. The diversity initiatives that amounted to little more than corporate theater. The way companies only moved when the public demanded it, when the financial risk became too great to ignore. She suspected Vanguard was about to learn that lesson the hard way. And she intended to make sure the full story got told. Angela glanced toward the front of the cabin, where she could just make out the top of Evan's head above the seat back. She'd email him when they landed, request an interview. Tell him she wanted to write something substantive, something that went beyond the clickbait outrage cycle. She had a feeling he'd say yes. People like Evan Carter didn't conduct audits in secret because they wanted to stay anonymous. They did it because they were building a case. And cases required evidence, documentation, public record. Angela had a feeling this story was just getting started. In the rear galley, Lauren stood with her back against the counter, her phone clutched in her hand, her eyes fixed on the screen, even though every refresh brought fresh waves of condemnation. Her mentions were flooded. Her DMs were full of messages ranging from supportive to vicious. Someone had found her Instagram and was leaving comments on photos from 2 years ago. Her vacation in Mexico, her sister's wedding, a selfie with her cat. Racist. Hope you lose everything. People like you are why we can't have nice things. Lauren wanted to respond, wanted to defend herself, wanted to explain that she wasn't a bad person, that she'd made a mistake in judgment, but that didn't make her a racist, that she'd been trying to do her job, and yes, maybe she'd let her assumptions cloud her perception, but that didn't mean she deserved to have her entire life dissected by strangers. But she didn't. Because somewhere beneath the panic and the defensiveness, a small voice was asking a question she didn't want to answer. What if they were right? Not about her being irredeemable or evil or deserving of anonymous threats, but about the core of it, about the assumption she'd made, about the fact that she'd looked at Evan Carter and seen a problem before she'd seen a person. Lauren had grown up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and difference was something that happened on TV or in cities far away. She'd moved to New York 6 years ago for this job, proud to be working for a major airline, excited by the diversity of the city, even as she struggled to understand it, to navigate its unspoken rules and complicated histories. She'd thought of herself as open-minded. She'd had black coworkers, black neighbors, even a black boyfriend briefly in college. She'd never used slurs, never made overtly racist comments, never considered herself part of the problem. But tonight, faced with Evan Carter in his hoodie and jeans, some other part of her had taken over, a part shaped by images she'd absorbed from movies and news coverage and casual comments from family members, a part that had learned to associate certain appearances with certain assumptions, a part that had never been challenged or examined because it operated below the level of conscious thought. That was the thing about bias Lauren was beginning to understand. It didn't announce itself. It didn't show up wearing a hood or shouting slurs. It showed up in small moments, in snap judgments, in the gap between who you thought you were and what you actually did when no one was watching. Except someone had been watching. Dozens of someones. And now the whole world was watching too. Lauren heard footsteps and looked up to find another flight attendant, a woman named Tasha who worked the main cabin, standing in the galley entrance. Tasha was black, 40-something, with 20 years of seniority and a reputation for not taking shit from anyone. They'd worked together before, had shared meals during layovers, had complained about difficult passengers and scheduling headaches. But now Tasha was looking at Lauren with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite anger, not quite pity, but something in between. "You okay?" Tasha asked quietly. Lauren almost laughed. The question was absurd given everything, but it was also the first kind word anyone had offered her in the last 2 hours. "No," Lauren said honestly, "I'm really not." Tasha stepped into the galley and leaned against the opposite counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I saw the video," Tasha said finally. Lauren flinched. "I've been doing this job for 20 years, Tasha continued, her voice measured, careful. "And I can't count the number of times I've been asked to show my employee ID when I'm in uniform. The number of times passengers have assumed I'm not the lead attendant, even when I'm clearly running the cabin. The number of times I've had to smile through someone asking me to get them another drink while they're talking to my white colleague." Lauren looked up, meeting Tasha's eyes. "I'm not saying this to make you feel worse," Tasha said. "I'm saying it so you understand. What you did to that passenger tonight, that's what it feels like. That assumption that we don't belong, that we need to prove ourselves in ways other people don't." "I didn't mean—" Lauren started, but Tasha held up a hand. "I know you didn't mean it. Most people don't. That's the whole problem." Tasha's voice was gentle but firm. "You're not a bad person, Lauren, but you did a bad thing. And now you have to decide what you're going to do about it." "What can I do?" Lauren's voice was barely a whisper. "It's already everywhere. My career is over." "Maybe," Tasha said. Or maybe this is the beginning of something different. Maybe you use this to actually learn something, to change, to become someone who questions her assumptions instead of acting on them. She pushed off the counter and turned to leave, then paused. That passenger in 3A? Tasha said. He could have made a scene, could have yelled, could have demanded to speak to a manager right away, could have made you look even worse. But he didn't. He stayed calm. He let you reveal yourself. That takes control. That takes experience. That tells me he's dealt with this before. Tasha met Lauren's eyes one more time. Think about that. Think about how many times he's probably had to be twice as calm, twice as professional, twice as credentialed just to be treated like a human being. And then ask yourself if what you did was just a mistake or if it was part of something bigger. She left Lauren alone in the galley, and for the first time since the confrontation, Lauren felt something crack inside her. Not defensiveness, not panic, but something raw. Shame. Real, genuine shame. Not because the internet was angry, but because Tasha was right. The plane droned westward through the night. Somewhere over Kansas, the cabin settled into the deep quiet of a red-eye flight. Passengers sleeping or pretending to sleep, the occasional cough or rustle of movement breaking the silence. But in the spaces between sleep and waking, in the thoughts that churned through the minds of everyone aboard Flight 22847, the confrontation in first class continued to reverberate. For Evan, it was one more data point in a pattern he'd spent years documenting. For Marcus, it was a reminder of battles still unfinished. For Angela, it was a story demanding to be told. For Tasha, it was exhaustion and recognition and the faint hope that maybe this time something might actually change. And for Lauren, it was the beginning of a reckoning she couldn't yet name. The flight attendant call button chimed from first class. Lauren's stomach tightened. She checked the panel. Seat 3A. She walked slowly up the aisle, her heart pounding, wondering what Evan Carter could possibly want from her now. He was awake, his tablet put away, his expression neutral. Yes? Lauren's voice was barely steady. Evan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I'd like another coffee, please. No rush. That was all. No accusation, no lecture, no confrontation, just a simple request. Lauren nodded, unable to speak, and retreated to the galley. Her hands shook as she poured the coffee, and she had to steady the pot with both hands to keep from spilling. When she brought it back to him, Evan took it with a polite thank you and returned his attention to the window. Lauren walked back to the galley and sank onto the jump seat, and for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she started to cry. Quietly, carefully, so no one would hear. The tears dried somewhere over Colorado, leaving Lauren hollow and exhausted. She'd retreated to the rear lavatory to compose herself, splashing cold water on her face, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror. When she emerged, the cabin was still dark, still quiet, the passengers cocooned in their own worlds of sleep and distraction. But something had shifted inside her. The panic was still there, the fear of what waited for her when they landed, but underneath it was something else. A kind of resignation mixed with the faint stirring of something that might have been understanding. She thought about Tasha's words, about Evan's calm, about the video looping endlessly across social media, turning her worst moment into permanent public record. And she thought about a conversation she'd had 3 years ago with her father, sitting on the porch of her childhood home during Christmas break. Her father was a good man, or at least Lauren had always believed he was. He'd worked construction his whole life, had coached Little League, had never missed one of her school plays. But that night, after a few beers, he'd started talking about the neighborhood changing, about new families moving in, about how things weren't like they used to be. I'm not racist, he'd said, the way people always did before saying something that proved otherwise. But you have to admit, when certain types move in, property values go down. That's just economics. Lauren had nodded along, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge him, unwilling to call it what it was. She told herself it was generational, that her father came from a different time, that his views didn't reflect her own. But now, standing in the galley of Flight 2847, with her career crumbling and her face viral, Lauren wondered if she'd been lying to herself. If the assumptions she'd made about Evan Carter had their roots in conversations she'd never questioned, in beliefs she'd absorbed without examination, in the comfortable certainty that she was one of the good ones because she'd never said the quiet part out loud. The seatbelt sign chimed on. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into Los Angeles, asking the crew to prepare the cabin for landing. Lauren moved through her duties on autopilot, collecting trash, checking seatbelts, stowing loose items. She avoided first class, letting another attendant handle that section. She couldn't face Evan again, couldn't face the weight of his silent judgment, or worse, his quiet grace. When she finally had to walk through first class for the final cabin check, she kept her eyes down, moving quickly, professionally, invisibly. But as she passed row 3, Evan spoke. "Excuse me." Lauren froze. She turned slowly, her heart in her throat. Evan was looking at her directly now, his expression unreadable. "Yes, sir?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I want you to know something," Evan said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "What happened tonight, that confrontation? It wasn't personal." Lauren blinked, confused. "I don't understand." "I mean that I don't hate you," Evan continued. "I don't know you, but I do know the system that trained you, that shaped your assumptions, that made what happened tonight feel normal to you. That's what needs to change." Lauren felt her throat tighten. She wanted to respond, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. Evan held her gaze for a moment longer. "When this all comes out, and it will, you're going to have a choice. You can dig in, defend yourself, insist it wasn't about race. Or you can actually listen, actually learn, actually become part of the solution." He paused, then added, "I hope you choose the second option." Before Lauren could respond, he turned back to the window, the conversation clearly over. Lauren stood there for a moment, her chest tight, her mind reeling. Then she turned and walked back to the galley, Evan's words echoing in her head. It wasn't personal, except it was. It had to be. She'd humiliated him, questioned his right to exist in a space he'd paid for, threatened him with security. But Evan was telling her it was bigger than that he'd expected it, that he'd been ready for it. That realization made everything worse. The plane descended through layers of cloud, the lights of Los Angeles sprawling below like a vast electric constellation. Lauren strapped into the jump seat for landing, her hands folded in her lap, her future uncertain. She thought about choices, about what kind of person she wanted to be, about whether it was too late to become someone different. The wheels touched down with a jolt, and Flight 22847 taxied toward the gate. The landing was smooth, but the moment the plane stopped at the gate, Lauren felt the air in the cabin change. Passengers began gathering their belongings, checking phones, preparing to disembark. But there was an unusual tension, a collective awareness that this flight had been different, that something significant had occurred. In first class, several passengers were still on their phones, still posting, still commenting on the video that had taken on a life of its own. Evan remained seated as other first-class passengers filed past, some glancing at him with recognition, with sympathy, with curiosity. A few nodded. One woman, an older black passenger who'd been sitting across the aisle, stopped beside his seat. "I'm glad you didn't let them intimidate you," she said quietly. "I've been flying for 40 years, and I've seen it happen too many times. Usually, people just accept it and move on." Evan looked up at her and offered a small smile. "Not this time." The woman nodded, her eyes bright. "Good. It's about damn time." She moved on, and Evan gathered his backpack, waiting for the aisle to clear. He was in no hurry. He knew what was waiting, not just the usual chaos of LAX, but the beginning of something bigger. His phone buzzed with another message from Sandra Yates. "PR team is drafting a statement. Legal wants to be looped in before we go public. Can you be at headquarters by 10 a.m.? Evan checked his watch. It was just past 11 p.m. Pacific. He'd planned to go straight to his apartment to sleep for a few hours before the meeting, but he knew sleep wasn't coming tonight. He typed back, "I'll be there at 9. Want to review the data first." As he stood and moved toward the exit, he passed Lauren in the galley. She was facing away from him, her shoulders rigid, her posture defensive. Evan paused for just a moment, considering whether to say anything else, but he decided against it. He'd said what needed to be said. The rest was up to her. He stepped off the plane and into the jetway, leaving Flight 2847 behind. But the story was just beginning. Marcus Green waited until most of the passengers had deplaned before gathering his carry-on and making his way up the aisle. As he passed the galley, he saw Lauren standing alone, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. On impulse, he stopped. "Hey," he said gently. Lauren looked up, startled. "I'm an attorney," Marcus continued. "Civil rights cases, mostly. And I just want you to know what comes next is going to be hard. You're going to have people telling you to lawyer up, to say nothing, to protect yourself." Lauren nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "But if you actually want to make this right," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm, "the first step is taking responsibility. Not defending, not explaining, just acknowledging what you did and why it was wrong." He pulled a business card from his wallet and set it on the counter. "If you decide you want to do that, really do that, not just performatively, call me. I can connect you with people who do this work, trainers, consultants, educators, people who can help you understand what happened tonight and how to be better." Lauren stared at the card, then up at Marcus. "Why would you help me?" Marcus considered the question. "Because I've seen this cycle 1,000 times. Someone does something racist, the internet explodes. The person gets fired or canceled, and nothing actually changes. They just become more entrenched in their defensiveness." He paused. "But every once in a while, someone actually listens, actually grows. And when that happens, they can become powerful advocates for change. Not because they're perfect, but because they know what it's like to be wrong and to do the work to be better." He picked up his bag. "That's your choice to make, but the offer's there if you want it." Marcus walked off the plane, leaving Lauren alone with his card and his words. She picked up the card, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. Marcus Green, Escrivá, civil rights attorney. Justice delayed is justice denied. Lauren slipped the card into her pocket and began the final cabin check, her mind churning. Angela Park was one of the last passengers off, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, her mind already constructing the article she'd write. As she stepped into the terminal, she saw Evan Carter ahead of her, walking with purposeful strides toward the baggage claim. She quickened her pace, catching up to him near the escalators. "Mr. Carter?" Evan turned, his expression guarded. "Angela Park, Wired Magazine." She offered her hand. "I was on your flight. I saw what happened, and I've been doing some research." Evan shook her hand but said nothing, waiting. "I know about Carter Analytics," Angela continued. "I know about the audit, and I think there's a much bigger story here than just a viral video." Evan studied her for a moment. "You want an exclusive." "I want to tell the full story," Angela corrected. "Not just the outrage, but the systems behind it. The data, the patterns, the fact that Vanguard hired you to find exactly what you found tonight." Evan's expression shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, but something close to respect. "I can't comment on active client work," he said carefully, "but if you want to write about algorithmic bias in customer service, about how discrimination gets coded into corporate training, about why these incidents keep happening despite diversity statements and PR campaigns, I can point you toward the research." Angela pulled out her phone. "Can I get your number? I'd like to set up a proper interview once things settle." Evan hesitated, then rattled off his number. "Give me 48 hours. After that, I'll have more I can share." Angela nodded, already typing notes. "One more question, off the record. Why did you stay so calm tonight? Most people would have lost it." Evan's expression grew distant. "Because anger doesn't change systems. Documentation does. Evidence does. Strategic pressure does." He paused. "And because I've learned that the best way to expose bias is to give it enough space to reveal itself. If I'd yelled, if I'd been aggressive, the narrative would have shifted. It would have been about an angry black man causing a scene. Instead, it's about exactly what it should be about." Angela understood. "The system, not the individual." "The individual is part of the system," Evan said. "But yes, that flight attendant made a choice tonight. But that choice was shaped by training, by culture, by 1,000 small signals telling her that someone like me didn't belong in first class." He adjusted his backpack. "That's what needs to change." Angela watched him walk away, her mind racing with angles, with questions, with the shape of the story she'd tell. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about how discrimination persisted in plain sight, how it adapted and evolved, how it hid behind policies and protocols while continuing to inflict the same old wounds, and she was going to make sure people understood that. Across town, in a modest apartment in Culver City, Sandra Yates sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and 3 phones charging beside her. She'd been on calls for the past 2 hours, with the CEO, with the board, with the PR team, with legal. The video had been viewed over 5 million times now. Major news outlets were picking it up. Celebrities were weighing in. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Vanguard Airlines was in full crisis mode, and Sandra was the one who had to navigate them through it. She'd been with Vanguard for 8 years, rising through HR to her current role as Chief Diversity Officer, a position created 3 years ago after a different viral incident, a different round of outrage, a different set of promises. She'd pushed for the Carter Analytics audit, had convinced the board that they needed external expertise, that they needed data to back up their diversity initiatives. But she'd also known it was a risk, because if the audit found what she suspected it would find, the company would have 2 choices: actually change or bury the findings and hope nobody noticed. Now, with the video everywhere and Evan's evidence waiting to be revealed, burial wasn't an option. Sandra pulled up the preliminary findings Evan had sent her earlier. She'd read them 3 times already, each pass making her stomach tighten. The data was irrefutable. Black passengers questioned at rates nearly 4 times higher than white passengers. Complaints dismissed or downplayed. Crew members with multiple documented incidents facing no disciplinary action. Training materials that emphasized profiling as a security measure without addressing racial bias. The whole thing was a ticking time bomb. And Lauren Hale had just lit the fuse. Sandra's phone buzzed with a call from the CEO, Jonathan Reeves. She answered on the second ring. "Sandra, tell me we have a plan." "We do," Sandra said, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her gut. "But you're not going to like it." "Try me." Sandra took a breath. "We go public with the audit. We release Carter's findings, not all of them, but enough to show we've been taking this seriously. We announce immediate policy changes, mandatory retraining, and we make an example of this incident." "Meaning what?" "Meaning Lauren Hale gets terminated, publicly, along with a statement about 0 tolerance for discriminatory behavior." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "She's got 6 years of service," Reeves said slowly. "Union's going to fight this." "Let them," Sandra said. "We have video evidence, we have a documented pattern, and we have 5 million people watching to see what we do next." Another pause. "What about Carter?" Reeves asked. "Can we count on him to be diplomatic?" Sandra almost laughed. "Evan Carter doesn't need to be diplomatic. He's got data, he's got receipts, and he's got every major news outlet calling him for comment." "Shit. Yeah." Sandra rubbed her temples. "But here's the thing. If we get ahead of this, if we own it and actually commit to change, we might come out of this better than if we'd buried it." "You really believe that?" Sandra thought about all the other companies she'd watched stumble through similar crises. The denials, the deflections, the carefully worded non-apologies that fooled no one. "I believe it's our only shot," she said. "We either lead the change or we get dragged into it. Those are the options." Reeves sighed. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning, full executive team. I want Carter there too." "Already scheduled for 9 a.m. "Good." Reeves paused. "Sandra, you know this is going to get ugly, right? The press, the lawsuits, the internal pushback." "I know. Can you handle it?" Sandra looked at her laptop, at the data on the screen, at the evidence of a problem she'd been trying to fix for 3 years with insufficient support and inadequate resources. "I've been handling it," she said quietly. "The question is whether the rest of you are ready to actually do something about it." She hung up before he could respond. Then she opened a new email and began drafting the statement they'd release in the morning, the one that would acknowledge the incident, announce the investigation, and promise change. She'd written versions of this statement before, after other incidents, other videos, other moments of public outrage. But this time felt different. This time they had Evan Carter. This time they had data they couldn't ignore. This time maybe, just maybe, something would actually change. Sandra worked through the night, refining the statement, coordinating with legal, preparing for the inevitable media storm. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she thought about Lauren Hale, about a woman who'd made a terrible choice, who'd revealed her biases on camera, who was about to become the face of a systemic problem that was so much bigger than any individual. Sandra felt a flicker of sympathy, but only a flicker, because she'd seen too many Lauren Hales over the years, too many people who insisted they weren't racist while acting on racist assumptions. Too many incidents brushed aside, too many complaints ignored, too many passengers humiliated while policies protected employees. If Lauren Hale became a cautionary tale, if her termination sent a message that this behavior had consequences, then maybe the next flight attendant would think twice. Maybe the next passenger wouldn't have to record their humiliation just to be believed. Maybe the system would finally start to change. Sandra saved the statement and closed her laptop. Outside her window, Los Angeles was waking up, the sky lightening from black to deep blue, early morning traffic beginning to hum on the streets below. In a few hours, Evan Carter would arrive at headquarters with his data and his evidence. In a few hours, the news cycle would explode with a story that went beyond one viral video. In a few hours, Vanguard Airlines would have to decide what kind of company it wanted to be. Sandra stood and walked to her window, looking out at the city. She'd spent her entire career fighting for equity in spaces that resisted it, pushing for change in systems designed to maintain the status quo. And she was tired. Bone tired, but not too tired to see this through, not when they were this close to actually making a difference. She picked up her phone and sent one final message to Evan. "Tomorrow changes everything. Are you ready?" His response came 30 seconds later. "I've been ready. Question is whether they are." Sandra smiled grimly. They were about to find out. At LAX, Lauren Hale sat alone in the crew lounge, waiting for the HR meeting she knew was coming. The other flight attendants had filtered out, some offering sympathetic looks, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Her phone was off. She couldn't bear to look at it anymore, couldn't stomach another wave of hate messages or viral tweets or news articles dissecting her character. Instead, she sat with Marcus Green's business card in her hand, reading and rereading the words embossed on its surface. Justice delayed is justice denied. She thought about Evan's calm, about Tasha's honesty, about Marcus's unexpected offer of help, about the choice she had to make. She could double down, hire a lawyer, issue a statement denying any racial motivation, claim she was just doing her job, that she'd been misunderstood, that the video didn't show the full context. She could fight this. Or she could admit the truth, that she'd looked at Evan Carter and made an assumption based on his appearance, based on implicit biases she'd never examined, based on the comfortable certainty that people like him didn't belong in spaces like first class, that she'd been wrong, that the wrongness went deeper than a single mistake, that it required more than an apology. It required change, real change, the kind that was uncomfortable and difficult and required admitting you weren't who you thought you were. Lauren looked up as the HR director entered the lounge, her expression grave. "Lauren," the woman said, "we need to talk." Lauren stood, slipping Marcus's card into her pocket. She didn't know yet what choice she'd make, but she knew that in the next few hours her entire life would change. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The HR director's name was Patricia Moreno, and she had the exhausted look of someone who'd been dealing with crises since before dawn. She gestured for Lauren to follow her into a small conference room tucked away from the main crew areas, the kind of space designed for difficult conversations that needed to happen away from prying eyes. Lauren's legs felt unsteady as she walked, her mind cycling through a dozen different scenarios, each one worse than the last. She'd never been called into HR before, had never imagined herself sitting on this side of the table, facing termination. Patricia closed the door and sat down across from Lauren, a manila folder and a laptop positioned between them like barriers. "Before we begin," Patricia said, her voice professional but not unkind, "I want you to know that you have the right to union representation for this meeting. Would you like me to call your rep?" Lauren shook her head. She didn't want to delay this, didn't want to sit in this room any longer than necessary while someone came to defend the indefensible. "Okay." Patricia opened the folder, revealing printed screenshots of tweets, news articles, and stills from the video. Lauren's own face stared back at her from multiple angles, frozen in moments of irritation and certainty. I'm sure you're aware that an incident occurred on Flight 2847 involving yourself and a first-class passenger, Patricia began, reading from what was clearly a scripted opening. The incident was recorded and has been widely circulated on social media. We've reviewed the video evidence, spoken with the supervisor on duty, and consulted with our legal team. Lauren nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Patricia looked up from the script, her expression softening slightly. Lauren, I need to ask you directly. In your own words, can you tell me what happened? This was it. The moment where Lauren could shape the narrative, could explain her side, could try to salvage something from the wreckage. She thought about Evan's words, about choices. I made an assumption, Lauren said quietly, the words coming out steadier than she expected. I saw a black passenger in casual clothes walking toward first class, and I assumed he didn't belong there. I questioned his ticket. I blocked him from his seat. I threatened to call security. Patricia was typing, her fingers moving quickly across her laptop keyboard. And why did you make that assumption? Patricia asked, her tone carefully neutral. Lauren could feel the weight of the question, the way it opened a door to deeper examination or easier deflection. She could say she thought there'd been a ticketing error. She could say she was just being thorough. She could dress it up in the language of protocol and procedure. But sitting in this sterile conference room with her career hanging by a thread, Lauren found she didn't have the energy for pretense anymore. Because of the way he looked, she said, because some part of me, a part I didn't even know was there, decided that a black man in a hoodie couldn't possibly belong in first class, that he must have made a mistake or was trying to sneak an upgrade or didn't have the right ticket. She took a shaky breath. I didn't think I was being racist. I told myself I was just doing my job, but I was. I was being racist, and the fact that I didn't recognize it in the moment, that makes it worse, not better. Patricia stopped typing. She looked at Lauren with an expression that was hard to read. Surprise, perhaps, or respect for the honesty. That's a significant admission, Patricia said carefully. It's the truth. Lauren's voice cracked slightly. I've been reading the comments, the articles, listening to people explain exactly what I did wrong, and they're right, all of them. I looked at that passenger and saw a problem instead of a person. Patricia closed the laptop and folded her hands on the table. Lauren, I appreciate your honesty, truly, but you need to understand the position the airline is in. This video has been viewed millions of times. News outlets are covering it. Civil rights organizations are demanding accountability. The passenger you confronted, do you know who he is? Lauren shook her head. His name is Evan Carter. He's the CEO of Carter Analytics, a consulting firm that specializes in detecting algorithmic bias and conducting discrimination audits. Patricia paused, letting that sink in. He was hired by Vanguard Airlines 6 months ago to audit our customer service practices and identify patterns of discriminatory treatment. Lauren felt the blood drain from her face. What? The confrontation you had with him wasn't random, Patricia continued. It was a test. He booked that flight specifically to see how he'd be treated. And everything that happened, your assumptions, your actions, the way you escalated the situation, all of it is now documented as part of his audit findings. Lauren's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table, trying to steady herself. So this was planned? The audit was planned, Patricia clarified. Your reaction was your own. But yes, Mr. Carter was conducting field research, and you provided him with exactly the kind of evidence he was looking for. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Lauren thought about Evan's calm, his patience, the way he'd seemed almost unsurprised by her hostility. He'd been ready because he'd expected it, because he'd seen it before, because the system was so predictable in its bias that he could design a test around it, and she'd failed that test spectacularly. What happens now? Lauren asked, though she already knew the answer. Patricia's expression turned somber. The airline is terminating your employment, effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks of severance pay as per your contract, but you're being removed from the schedule and your access to company systems will be revoked today. Lauren nodded, the words washing over her like cold water. She'd expected this, had known it was coming, but hearing it made it real in a way that all the online outrage hadn't. There's more, Patricia said. The airline will be issuing a public statement about the incident. They're going to name you specifically and state that your actions don't reflect company values. They're using this as an opportunity to announce new training initiatives and policy changes. So I'm the example, Lauren said flatly. You're the catalyst, Patricia corrected gently. What you did was wrong, Lauren, but you're not the only employee who's made assumptions like this. You're just the one who got caught on camera. The company is using this moment to address systemic issues that should have been addressed years ago. Lauren thought about all the other flight attendants she'd worked with, all the casual comments and assumptions she'd heard over the years, the jokes about those people and certain types, the way crews would sometimes share knowing looks when particular passengers boarded, the unspoken hierarchies and judgments that shaped how service was delivered. She'd been part of that culture, had absorbed its lessons without questioning them, and now she was paying the price. But Patricia was right. She wasn't the disease, she was a symptom. That didn't absolve her, but it meant her termination alone wouldn't fix anything. Can I ask you something? Lauren said. Patricia nodded. The other employees, the ones who've made similar assumptions, who've treated passengers differently based on race, are they going to be held accountable too? Patricia's expression flickered with something that might have been approval. Mr. Carter's audit identified patterns involving multiple employees across multiple routes. The company is reviewing all of those cases. Some will result in additional training. Others may result in disciplinary action. But yes, this goes beyond you. Lauren absorbed that, feeling a strange mix of relief and bitterness. She was glad the problem was being addressed, but she couldn't help feeling like she'd been singled out, not because her actions were uniquely terrible, but because they'd been uniquely visible. For what it's worth, Patricia said, the fact that you're taking responsibility rather than making excuses, that matters. Not to the airline, maybe, but to your own growth. A lot of people in your position would be threatening lawsuits and claiming they were set up. I was thinking about that, Lauren admitted. But what would be the point? The video shows exactly what happened. And even if I could argue I was entrapped or whatever, that doesn't change the fact that I made those assumptions, that I treated Mr. Carter the way I did. Patricia stood, gathering her papers. You'll need to sign some exit paperwork, and I'd strongly recommend you stay off social media for a while. This storm is going to get worse before it gets better. Lauren stood as well, her legs still unsteady. Miss Moreno, do you think, is there any way to make this right, to actually fix what I broke? Patricia considered the question. I think you can undo what happened, but you can choose what you do next. You can learn from this, grow from this, become someone who understands why it was wrong and works to be better. That's not redemption exactly, but it's a start. She walked Lauren back to her locker, where Lauren collected her few personal items, a coffee mug, a spare sweater, a photo of her sister's kids. The other crew members avoided looking at her, busying themselves with suddenly urgent tasks. Only Tasha approached as Lauren was closing her locker for the last time. I heard, Tasha said quietly. Lauren nodded, not trusting herself to speak. What are you going to do now? Lauren pulled Marcus Green's business card from her pocket and showed it to Tasha. I think I'm going to make some calls, see if I can actually learn something from this instead of just wallowing. Tasha's expression softened. That's good. That's really good. She hesitated, then added, most people would just be angry right now, defensive. The fact that you're thinking about growth, that says something. It doesn't change what I did. No, Tasha agreed, but it might change what you become. They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Tasha squeezed Lauren's shoulder and walked away. Lauren left the crew lounge and made her way through the terminal, her small box of belongings clutched against her chest. Around her, LAX hummed with its usual chaos, travelers rushing to gates, families reuniting, the endless cycle of arrivals and departures. No one looked at her twice. No one recognized her as the woman from the video. Here, in the anonymous flow of the airport, she was just another person moving through space. But that anonymity wouldn't last. By tonight, news outlets would have her full name, her photo, her entire digital history dissected for public consumption. She thought about going home, pulling the blinds, unplugging from the world, but instead she pulled out her phone and dialed the number on Marcus Green's card. He answered on the third ring. Marcus Green. Mr. Green, this is Lauren Hale from the flight. You gave me your card and said to call if I wanted to actually do the work. There was a pause. Then Marcus said, I'm glad you called. Are you somewhere you can talk? I just got fired, Lauren said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. I'm walking out of LAX right now, and I don't know what to do next. Okay, Marcus said, his voice calm and steady. First thing, go home. Take care of yourself. Eat something, sleep if you can. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. And then if you're serious about this, I'm going to connect you with some people. Educators, trainers, folks who do anti-racism work. They're going to ask you hard questions. They're going to make you uncomfortable. They're going to challenge everything you think you know about yourself. Lauren swallowed hard. Okay. This isn't going to be easy, Marcus warned, and it's not going to make the internet forgive you. Most people are going to see you as the villain of this story no matter what you do. Are you prepared for that? Lauren thought about the video, about her face frozen in judgment, about the permanence of the internet. I don't have a choice, she said. I can either hide from what I did or I can face it, and hiding isn't going to make it go away. No, Marcus agreed. It won't. He gave her the name and contact information for a woman named Dr. Angela Morrison, who ran anti-racism workshops and trained organizations on implicit bias. Tell her I sent you, Marcus said. She'll know what to do. Thank you, Lauren said. I know I don't deserve— Stop, Marcus interrupted gently. This isn't about what you deserve. It's about what you're willing to do. Call Dr. Morrison. Show up ready to learn. And Lauren? Yes? The fact that you're making this call, that you're not just retreating into defensiveness, that's important. Don't lose sight of that. Lauren ended the call and stood on the curb outside the terminal, watching taxis and ride shares pick up passengers. The morning sun was bright and harsh, Los Angeles waking up to a day that would bring fresh outrage, fresh headlines, fresh scrutiny of the woman who'd become the face of discrimination in the friendly skies. But for the first time since the confrontation, Lauren felt something other than panic or shame. She felt the faintest glimmer of purpose. She couldn't undo what she'd done, couldn't erase the video or take back her assumptions or spare Evan Carter the humiliation she'd inflicted. But she could choose what happened next. She could choose to actually learn, to actually change, to become someone who understood not just that what she'd done was wrong, but why it was wrong and how to be better. It wouldn't be redemption. It wouldn't make her a hero, but it would be something. And right now, something was all she had. Across town, Evan Carter sat in a conference room on the 32nd floor of Vanguard Airlines corporate headquarters, surrounded by executives who looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. The table was massive, polished mahogany that probably cost more than Evan's first car, and arrayed around it were the people who ran one of the country's largest carriers. CEO Jonathan Reeves at the head, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Sandra Yates to his right, looking both exhausted and determined. The chief legal officer, the chief operating officer, the VP of communications, all of them with laptops open and coffee cups positioned like shields. Evan had his tablet in front of him, the screen displaying the opening page of his full audit report. Let's begin, Reeves said, his voice carrying the forced calm of someone trying to project control in an uncontrollable situation. Mr. Carter, thank you for joining us on short notice. I think we're all aware of what happened last night and the visibility it's generated. 5.8 million views as of an hour ago. The VP of Communications interjected, her voice tight. And climbing. We're getting press inquiries from every major outlet. CNN wants a statement by noon. Reeves nodded grimly. Sandra, you've been coordinating with Mr. Carter on the audit. Can you walk us through where we are? Sandra opened her laptop and pulled up a presentation. For the past 6 months, Carter Analytics has been conducting a comprehensive review of our customer service practices, complaint data, and employee training protocols. What they found is significant. She clicked to the first slide, which showed a series of graphs and statistics. Evan watched the executives' faces as they processed the data, watched them pale, watched them exchange glances, watched reality settle over them like a heavy blanket. Black passengers are 7 times more likely to have their tickets questioned, Sandra read from the slide. They're 2.4 times more likely to be asked to move seats, 5.1 times more likely to be removed from flights, and 6.2 times more likely to have complaints dismissed or unresolved compared to white passengers with identical booking profiles and behavior patterns. These numbers can't be right, the COO said, though his voice lacked conviction. They're right, Evan said quietly. I've reviewed them personally. My team has triple-checked the methodology, and last night I experienced the pattern firsthand. He pulled up the video on his tablet and turned it so the executives could see. They'd all watched it already, probably multiple times, but seeing it again in this context as evidence, as proof, as undeniable documentation of systemic failure made it hit differently. They watched in silence as the scene played out. Evan being blocked, questioned, threatened. Lauren's face, her tone, her absolute certainty that he didn't belong. When it ended, no one spoke for a long moment. Ms. Hale has been terminated, Reeves said finally. Effective this morning. That's a start, Evan replied. But she's not the problem. She's a symptom. What do you mean? The legal officer asked, his pen poised over a legal pad. Evan pulled up another document. In the past 5 years, there have been 43 documented incidents similar to what happened to me last night. Passengers of color questioned about their tickets, asked to prove they belong in premium cabins, removed from flights for behavior that wouldn't have triggered intervention if the passenger were white. He paused, letting that sink in. Of those 43 incidents, 37 involved employees who'd been with the company for more than 3 years. 21 involved employees who'd received complaints before. And in every single case, the company's response was the same. A note in the employee's file, maybe a verbal warning, and then business as usual. Are you saying we've been aware of this pattern? Reeves's voice had an edge now. I'm saying the data was there, Evan replied evenly. Whether anyone was looking at it is another question. Sandra jumped in. That's part of why I pushed for this audit. We have diversity statements, we have training modules, we have policies on paper, but we've never actually examined whether those policies are being followed or whether they're effective. And your conclusion? Reeves asked, though he clearly didn't want to hear the answer. They're not, Evan said bluntly. Your current training on implicit bias consists of a 40-minute online module that employees complete once during onboarding. There's no follow-up, no accountability measures, no system for identifying employees who demonstrate patterns of bias. You collect complaint data, but you don't analyze it for demographic patterns. And when incidents do occur, the focus is always on minimizing liability rather than addressing root causes. The VP of Communications was typing furiously. So what are you recommending? More training? Policy changes? What's the fix? Evan brought up his final slide. Comprehensive reform. Mandatory annual bias training with accountability measures. Demographic analysis of all complaints and incidents. Clear consequences for discriminatory behavior applied consistently. Independent review of employee-passenger interactions. And transparency. Publishing your data, your findings, your progress. That's going to cost millions, the COO said. The lawsuit from last night is going to cost you more, Evan countered. Not to mention the brand damage, the loss of customer trust, the talent you'll lose when people realize you're not serious about equity. Reeves leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And if we do this, if we implement everything you're suggesting, how do we know it'll work? You don't, Evan said honestly. Culture change takes time, but what I can tell you is that every company I've worked with that's taken this seriously has seen measurable improvement. Complaint rates drop, employee satisfaction increases, customer trust rebuilds. It's not magic, it's just doing the work. There was a long silence. Evan could see them calculating the cost of change versus the cost of staying the same, the risk of transparency versus the risk of another viral incident. Finally, Sandra spoke. We have an opportunity here. We can either be the company that got caught and made excuses, or we can be the company that got caught and actually fixed the problem. Last night was terrible, but it gave us something valuable, proof that the problem exists and a blueprint for solving it. She looked around the table. Mr. Carter is offering us a roadmap. The question is whether we're brave enough to follow it. Reeves drummed his fingers on the table, then nodded slowly. Draft the statement, announce the findings, the termination, and our commitment to reform. I want a detailed implementation plan by the end of the week. He turned to Evan, and I want you to stay on as a consultant through the implementation phase. Will you do that? Evan considered. He'd completed the audit, delivered the findings. He could walk away now, let them fumble through the changes on their own. But that wasn't why he did this work. Yes, he said. On the condition that you commit to full transparency. You publish the data, you report on progress, and you accept independent verification of results. Agreed, Reeves said, extending his hand across the table. They shook, and Evan felt the weight of what they'd just set in motion. This wasn't justice, exactly. Lauren Hale had lost her job, but dozens of other employees with similar patterns were still working. The system that had shaped her assumptions was still in place, still shaping others. But it was a beginning, a crack in the foundation, and sometimes that was enough to bring the whole structure down. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, hammering out details, assigning responsibilities, preparing for the media onslaught that would begin the moment they released their statement. When it finally ended, Evan gathered his materials and headed for the elevator. Sandra caught up with him in the hallway. Thank you, she said quietly, for doing this, for not letting us bury it. Evan smiled slightly. You hired me to find the truth. I just delivered it. Still, Sandra hesitated. That couldn't have been easy. Being on that flight, experiencing that treatment firsthand. Are you okay? Evan thought about the question. Was he okay? He'd been questioned, humiliated, threatened with removal, all because he'd dared to exist in a space someone else decided he didn't belong in. I'm tired, he said honestly. Tired of having to prove I belong. Tired of documenting the same patterns over and over. Tired of watching companies promise change and then doing the bare minimum. But, Sandra prompted. But I'm not giving up, Evan finished, because the alternative is accepting that this is just how things are. And I can't do that. Sandra nodded, understanding in her eyes. Well, you've got at least one ally in this fight. I'm counting on more than one, Evan said. Change doesn't happen because of individuals. It happens because enough people decide they're done with the status quo. He stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, he thought about Lauren Hale. She'd been fired, vilified, made into a cautionary tale, but Evan wondered what would happen next for her, whether she'd retreat into defensiveness and victimhood, or whether she'd actually do the work of understanding what she'd done and why. He hoped for the latter, not for her sake necessarily, but because the world needed more people willing to confront their own biases, to admit when they were wrong, to choose growth over comfort. The elevator descended, carrying Evan back to ground level, back to the world that was waking up to a story that would dominate news cycles for days to come. And somewhere in that same city, Lauren Hale was making a choice about what kind of person she wanted to become. The system had failed them both. But the story wasn't over yet. 3 months later, Lauren Hale sat in a circle of folding chairs in a community center in Silver Lake, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Around her sat 12 other people, each of them grappling with their own reckonings, their own moments of being forced to confront truths they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. This was her 8th session with Dr. Angela Morrison's anti-racism workshop, and each one had been harder than the last. Not because Dr. Morrison was cruel or judgmental, but because she refused to let anyone hide behind comfortable lies or performative guilt. Lauren, Dr. Morrison said now, her dark eyes kind but unflinching. You've been quiet today. Where are you? Lauren looked up from her coffee. The other participants were watching her with varying degrees of sympathy and curiosity. They all knew her story. The video had been inescapable, and even now, 3 months later, it still circulated online as a cautionary tale, a teaching tool, a piece of evidence in ongoing conversations about systemic racism. I've been thinking about something Marcus said to me, Lauren began, her voice quiet but steady. He told me that taking responsibility wasn't the same as redemption, that I couldn't earn forgiveness through a few workshops and some good intentions. And how does that make you feel? Dr. Morrison asked. Honest, Lauren said, like I'm finally starting to see things clearly instead of through the filter of what I want to believe about myself. She set down the coffee cup and looked around the circle. I used to think I was a good person who made a mistake. But the more I've learned, the more I realize I was a person carrying around a lot of unexamined prejudice who finally got caught acting on it. The mistake wasn't what I did on that plane. The mistake was spending 32 years not questioning the assumptions I was raised with. Dr. Morrison nodded. Tell us about those assumptions. Lauren took a breath. This part was always hard, excavating the beliefs she'd absorbed, naming them, holding them up to the light. I grew up in a town that was 97% white, she said. The only black people I really encountered were on TV or in the news, and the stories were always the same: crime, poverty, problems. My dad would make comments about those people in certain neighborhoods, and I'd feel uncomfortable, but I never challenged him. I told myself it was generational, that he didn't mean anything by it. She paused, gathering courage. And then I moved to New York, and I thought I was so progressive, so open-minded, because I lived in a diverse city and had black coworkers. But I never actually examined my beliefs. I never asked myself why I felt nervous when a black man got on an elevator with me, or why I clutched my purse tighter in certain neighborhoods, or why I made assumptions about who belonged where based on how they looked. And on the plane? Dr. Morrison prompted gently. On the plane, all of that came out, Lauren said, her voice cracking slightly. I saw Evan Carter, and I didn't see a person. I saw a threat to the order I was supposed to maintain. I saw someone who didn't fit my picture of what a first-class passenger should look like. And I acted on that without even thinking, because those assumptions were so deep I didn't recognize them as assumptions. One of the other participants, a middle-aged white man named David, who'd been fired from his teaching job for making racially insensitive comments in class, spoke up. But you didn't use any slurs. You didn't say anything explicitly racist. How are you supposed to know? Lauren looked at him, recognizing the defensiveness in his voice because she'd heard it in her own for weeks after the incident. That's what I told myself at first, she said. But that's the thing about bias. It doesn't need slurs to do damage. It just needs assumptions. It needs the split-second judgment that someone doesn't belong. It needs the benefit of the doubt extended to some people and denied to others. Dr. Morrison smiled slightly. That's good, Lauren. You're starting to understand systems instead of just incidents. The session continued for another hour, each participant sharing their struggles, their realizations, their ongoing work to dismantle the prejudices they'd carried. When it ended, Lauren gathered her things and headed for the door, but Dr. Morrison caught her arm. Can we talk for a minute? They stepped into a small office off the main room. Dr. Morrison closed the door and gestured for Lauren to sit. I've been doing this work for 20 years, Dr. Morrison began, settling into her chair. And I've seen a lot of people come through these workshops. Some are here because HR mandated it. Some are here because they're afraid of being canceled. And some are here because they genuinely want to change. She looked at Lauren directly. You're in that third category. And I think you're ready for the next step. What next step? Lauren asked. Sharing your story, Dr. Morrison said. Not as an apology or an explanation, but as a teaching tool. Angela Park from Wired has been trying to reach you for weeks. She wants to write a follow-up piece, not about the incident, but about what you've done since, about the work you've been doing. Lauren felt her stomach tighten. I don't know if I'm ready for that. People still hate me. They're not going to suddenly forgive me because I took some workshops. You're right, Dr. Morrison agreed. They won't. And you shouldn't do this for forgiveness. You should do it because your story, the real story, not the viral video, might help someone else recognize their own biases before they act on them. Lauren thought about that. Thought about all the comments she'd read online from people insisting they would never do what she did, that they weren't like her, that this was an individual failing rather than a systemic one. What if it just makes things worse? Lauren asked. What if people see it as me trying to rehabilitate my image? Some will, Dr. Morrison said honestly, but others might actually listen, might see themselves in your journey, might start asking the questions you're asking. She leaned forward. Lauren, you can't undo what happened on that plane, but you can use it. You can turn your worst moment into something that actually contributes to change. That's not redemption, but it's purpose. Lauren sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of the choice. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll talk to her." Angela Park arrived at the coffee shop in Los Feliz 20 minutes early, her recorder already charged, her questions already drafted. She'd been chasing this interview for months, ever since Vanguard Airlines had released their statement and the story had evolved from a viral moment into a case study in corporate accountability. Her first article had focused on Evan Carter and the audit, on the systemic patterns he'd uncovered and the reforms Vanguard had committed to implementing. It had won her an award and cemented her reputation as a journalist who went deeper than surface outrage. But there was another story here, one she'd been waiting to tell. The story of what happened after the cancel culture mob moved on. Lauren arrived right on time, looking different from the woman in the video. Thinner, maybe. Older in the eyes. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, no makeup, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. They ordered coffee and found a quiet table in the back. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Angela said, pulling out her recorder. "I know it's not easy." "Nothing about the last 3 months has been easy," Lauren said with a slight smile. "But I'm learning that easy isn't the same as valuable." Angela hit record. "Let's start at the beginning. After you were fired, after the video went viral, what was that first week like?" Lauren took a breath. "Terrifying. I couldn't leave my apartment without being recognized. I got death threats. My family stopped talking to me because they were being harassed. I lost all my friends from the airline except one, and even she struggled with whether to stay in contact." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "But the worst part wasn't the external stuff. It was looking at myself and realizing I didn't know who I was. I'd spent my whole life thinking I was a good person, and then in one moment, I did something that revealed I'd been lying to myself." "When did that shift happen?" Angela asked. "When did it go from 'this is happening to me' to 'I did this'?" "When I called Marcus Green," Lauren said, "the attorney from the flight. He could have just ignored me, but instead he connected me with Dr. Morrison and her workshops. And in that first session, she asked me to describe what I'd done without using any qualifiers or excuses. Just the facts." Lauren's voice grew quieter. "And when I did that, when I just said, I blocked a black passenger from his seat because I assumed he didn't belong there, I couldn't hide from it anymore. I couldn't dress it up as a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was what it was." Angela made notes, her pen moving quickly across her pad. "Tell me about the workshops." "They're not what people think," Lauren said. "It's not about making white people feel bad or forcing us to grovel. It's about examining the systems we've internalized, the beliefs we carry without questioning them. Dr. Morrison has us trace where our assumptions come from: family, media, education, social environments. And then we have to sit with the discomfort of realizing how much of our worldview is built on prejudice." She paused. "The hardest part is accepting that good intentions don't matter if the impact is harmful. I didn't intend to be racist, but my actions were racist, and I had to learn that those two things aren't contradictory." Angela leaned forward. "What do you say to people who think you're just doing this to rehabilitate your image, that you're the real victim here?" Lauren met her eyes. "I'd say they're wrong. Evan Carter is the victim. Every black passenger who's been questioned, moved, removed, they're the victims. I'm just someone who got caught and is finally doing the work I should have been doing all along." She took a sip of coffee. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm not looking for forgiveness. I'm just trying to become someone who doesn't carry those biases anymore, who questions her assumptions, who sees people as people instead of threats to some imagined order." They talked for another hour, Lauren answering questions with a candor that surprised Angela. There was no defensiveness, no self-pity, no attempt to minimize what she'd done. Just honesty, raw, uncomfortable honesty. When the interview ended, Angela turned off the recorder and sat back. "Can I ask you something off the record?" Lauren nodded. "Do you think you'll ever forgive yourself?" Lauren considered the question. "I don't know if that's the right goal. Forgiving myself feels like letting myself off the hook. What I want is to be different, to be better, to never make that kind of assumption again." She smiled sadly. "And maybe, someday, to use what I learned to help other people recognize their own biases before they act on them. That feels more important than forgiveness." Angela understood. She packed up her recorder and notes, thanked Lauren again, and left the coffee shop with the shape of her story already forming in her mind. This wasn't a redemption narrative. It was something more complicated and more honest. It was the story of accountability, of ongoing work, of the uncomfortable truth that growth required sitting with shame rather than running from it. And she suspected her readers needed to hear it. 6 months after the incident on Flight 22847, Vanguard Airlines held a press conference to announce the results of their reform initiative. The room was packed with journalists, cameras, and stakeholders, all of them waiting to see whether the company would deliver on the promises they'd made in the immediate aftermath of the viral video. Sandra Yates stood at the podium, looking confident despite the exhaustion she felt. The past 6 months had been the hardest of her career, implementing new training protocols, overhauling complaint procedures, fighting internal resistance from employees and executives who resented the changes. But they'd done it, and now she had the data to prove it. 6 months ago, Sandra began, Vanguard Airlines faced a reckoning. A video of one of our employees treating a passenger with bias and disrespect went viral, and it forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our company culture and our systems. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation. Today, I'm here to share what we've done since then and what we've learned. The slide showed a timeline of changes: mandatory quarterly bias training for all customer-facing employees, new complaint review procedures that included demographic analysis, independent auditing of passenger interactions, clear consequences for discriminatory behavior applied consistently across all levels of the company. We've trained over 12,000 employees, Sandra continued. We've reviewed and revised every customer service protocol, and we've established an independent oversight committee that includes civil rights advocates, employees, and passengers to ensure accountability. She clicked to the next slide, which showed comparative data. The results have been significant. Complaints alleging racial discrimination have decreased by 68%. Passenger satisfaction scores among travelers of color have increased by 41%. And our employee engagement surveys show increased confidence in company values and leadership. A journalist in the front row raised her hand. What about the employees who resisted these changes? Were there consequences? Sandra nodded. We terminated 7 employees who refused to complete the training or who demonstrated continued patterns of bias. We demoted 3 managers who failed to address discriminatory behavior in their teams, and we're still reviewing ongoing cases. Another journalist spoke up. What about Lauren Hale? Has she had any contact with the company since her termination? No, Sandra said. Ms. Hale's termination stands, but I will say that I've followed her journey over the past 6 months, and I've been impressed by the work she's done to educate herself and to take responsibility for her actions. She paused. That doesn't mean she gets her job back. Actions have consequences. But it does suggest that people can grow and change even after serious failures. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, with Sandra fielding questions about costs, challenges, and future plans. When it ended, she stepped away from the podium and found Evan Carter waiting in the hallway. You did good, Evan said, offering his hand. Sandra shook it. We did good. This doesn't happen without your audit. The audit just provided the data, Evan said. You're the one who convinced the board to actually do something with it. They walked together toward the exit, past walls covered with photos of planes and destinations, promises of travel and connection. Do you think it'll last? Sandra asked. Or is this just a temporary response to bad publicity? Evan considered the question. Depends on what happens next. If you keep the pressure on, keep measuring and reporting, keep holding people accountable, then, yeah, it could become permanent culture change. But if you declare victory and move on, things will slide back. So no rest for the weary, Sandra said with a tired smile. Never, Evan agreed. But you've built something real here. You've created systems that will outlast the current crisis. That's more than most companies manage. They reached the lobby, and Evan turned to leave. But Sandra called after him. Evan, that night on the plane, I know it must have been hard, experiencing that treatment firsthand. Are you okay? Evan looked back at her, his expression thoughtful. You want the honest answer? Always. I'm tired of having to prove I belong, Evan said quietly. Tired of being the test case, the example, the person who has to stay calm while someone treats me like I'm a problem. But I'm also grateful that this time it actually led to change, that I didn't just document another incident that got buried. He smiled slightly. So yeah, I'm okay. And I'm hopeful that maybe the next black passenger who boards one of your planes won't have to go through what I went through. That's the goal, Sandra said. Evan nodded and walked out into the California sunshine, leaving Sandra standing in the lobby of a company that had been forced to confront its failures and had chosen, for now at least, to actually address them. 1 year after the incident, Marcus Green organized a panel discussion at UCLA Law School on systemic racism in the airline industry. The auditorium was packed with students, professors, activists, and industry professionals, all of them eager to hear from the people at the center of a case that had reshaped how companies approach discrimination. On the stage sat Evan Carter, Sandra Yates, Dr. Angela Morrison, and, to the surprise of many in the audience, Lauren Hale. The moderator, a professor of civil rights law, opened with a question directed at Evan. Can you talk about why you chose to conduct the audit the way you did? Why put yourself through that experience? Evan leaned toward his microphone. Because data alone doesn't change hearts and minds. Numbers can be disputed, dismissed, explained away. But video evidence of someone being treated poorly because of the color of their skin, that's harder to ignore. He paused. I knew there was a pattern. I'd seen it in the complaint data, in the incident reports. But I needed to document it happening in real time, with me as the subject. It was strategic, yes, but it was also personal. Because I'm tired of living in a world where my credentials, my success, my humanity can be erased by someone's assumptions. The moderator turned to Sandra. What was the internal reaction when the audit findings were revealed? Resistance, Sandra said honestly. A lot of employees felt attacked, felt like we were calling them racist. Some threatened to quit, some filed grievances with the union. She took a breath. But we pushed through because we had leadership support and because the data was irrefutable. And gradually, very gradually, people started to understand that this wasn't about individual blame. It was about systems that had failed, training that was inadequate, and a culture that had allowed bias to persist unchecked. The moderator looked at Lauren. The audience shifted, a ripple of curiosity and judgment moving through the room. Ms. Hale, you've been doing anti-racism work for the past year. Can you talk about that journey? Lauren's hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. A year ago, I was confronted with the worst version of myself, she began. I saw video evidence of me treating another human being with disrespect and bias, and I had to face the fact that I'd been carrying around prejudices I didn't even know I had. She looked out at the audience. The work I've been doing with Dr. Morrison isn't about redemption. It's not about making people like me again or rehabilitating my image. It's about understanding how I became a person who could look at Evan Carter and see a problem instead of a person. She paused, gathering courage. I grew up absorbing racist ideas from my family, my community, my media consumption. And I never questioned them because they were comfortable, because they reinforced my sense of belonging and safety. It took public humiliation and losing everything for me to finally examine those beliefs. A student in the audience raised their hand. Do you think you deserve forgiveness? Lauren shook her head. That's not for me to decide. Evan doesn't owe me forgiveness. The Black community doesn't owe me forgiveness. What I owe is ongoing work, continuing to educate myself, speaking up when I see bias in others, using my experience to help people recognize their own prejudices before they cause harm. Dr. Morrison spoke next. I want to add something here. Lauren represents something important, not because she's special, but because she's ordinary. She's not an overt white supremacist. She's not someone who uses slurs or joins hate groups. She's someone who absorbed bias through osmosis and never questioned it until she was forced to. She looked at the audience. Most racism in America looks like Lauren, not like hood-wearing extremists. It looks like assumptions, microaggressions, benefit of the doubt extended to some and denied to others. And until we're willing to examine those ordinary biases, we can't dismantle the systems they support. The discussion continued for 2 hours, ranging across topics of corporate accountability, individual responsibility, the role of public shaming in social change, and the difference between performative diversity and substantive reform. When it ended, Students lined up to ask questions, to share their own experiences, to grapple with the complex realities of bias and justice. Evan stood to the side, watching, feeling the weight of what they'd set in motion. This wasn't a happy ending. Lauren would never get her job back. Some people would never forgive her. And the systems of discrimination they'd exposed at Vanguard were replicated across countless other companies and industries. But it was progress, real, measurable, documented progress. And sometimes that was all you could ask for. As the crowd dispersed, Lauren approached Evan. They hadn't spoken directly since the night on the plane, hadn't been in the same room until today. "Thank you," Lauren said quietly, "for what you said during the panel, for acknowledging that I've been doing the work." Evan looked at her for a long moment. "I meant what I told you on the plane. It wasn't personal. You were part of a system, but you made a choice about what to do next, and that choice matters." "Does it change what I did?" Lauren asked. "No," Evan said honestly. "But it changes who you become, and that's not nothing." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Two people whose lives had collided in a moment of bias and accountability, forever linked by an incident that had reshaped both of their trajectories. "I hope you keep doing this work," Evan said finally. "Not for me, not for redemption, but because the world needs people who've actually confronted their biases and come out the other side willing to help others do the same." Lauren nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I will. I promise I will." Evan offered a small nod and walked away, and Lauren stood alone in the emptying auditorium, feeling the weight of the work still ahead, the growth still needed, the ongoing responsibility to be better than she'd been. It wasn't redemption, but it was purpose, and for now, that was enough. 2 years after Flight 2847, Evan Carter delivered a keynote address at a national conference on algorithmic bias and corporate accountability. The audience was filled with CEOs, diversity officers, data scientists, and activists, all of them trying to navigate the complex landscape of equity in an increasingly automated world. "We talk a lot about algorithms," Evan said from the stage, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "We worry about AI perpetuating bias, about facial recognition failing to see black faces, about hiring software screening out qualified candidates based on coded discrimination." He paused. "But we forget that human beings are algorithms too. We absorb data from our families, our communities, our media. We process that data through filters shaped by our experiences and our prejudices. And then we execute based on those calculations, often without even realizing we're running a program." He clicked to a slide showing the video from Flight 2847, Lauren blocking him, her face certain, her judgment complete. "This moment went viral because it was captured on camera," Evan continued. "But moments like this happen thousands of times a day without documentation. Every time someone is followed in a store, questioned at a border, pulled over by police, passed over for a job, bias is being executed like code." He looked out at the audience. "The work we do, auditing systems, analyzing data, implementing reforms, it's essential. But it's not enough if we don't also address the human algorithms, the beliefs and assumptions that shape how we see each other." He clicked to the next slide, showing the reforms implemented at Vanguard Airlines, the decrease in complaints, the increase in satisfaction. "This is what accountability looks like," Evan said. "Not perfection, not a single solution, but ongoing work, transparent measurement, and real consequences for failures." He smiled slightly. 2 years ago, I sat in seat 3A of a plane and experienced discrimination that I documented happening to others hundreds of times. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. But it was also an opportunity to turn data into narrative, to make the invisible visible, to force a system to confront its failures. He paused. "And here's what I've learned. Change is possible. Not easy, not fast, not guaranteed, but possible. When we combine documentation with pressure, when we demand transparency and accountability, when we refuse to accept that this is just how things are, we can reshape systems." The audience erupted in applause, and Evan felt the familiar mix of exhaustion and determination that defined his work. He'd spent years documenting bias, quantifying discrimination, turning human suffering into spreadsheets and graphs, and he'd keep doing it, because every audit, every report, Every piece of evidence he gathered was a weapon against the systems that insisted injustice was inevitable. It wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. And choices could be changed. After the keynote, Evan checked his phone and found a message from Sandra Yates. Year 2 audit results are in. Complaints down 73%. Employee satisfaction up 52%. Board-approved budget increase for ongoing training. We're doing it, Evan. We're actually doing it. He smiled and typed back, "Told you it was possible. Keep up the pressure." Then he scrolled through his news feed and saw Angela Park's latest article, a long-form piece about Lauren Hale, now working as a trainer with Dr. Morrison's organization, helping other people confront their biases before they caused harm. The article quoted Lauren, "I can't undo what I did, but I can use it. Every time I tell my story, every time I help someone recognize their own assumptions, I'm choosing to be part of the solution instead of just a cautionary tale." Evan closed the article and put his phone away. The work continued. It always would. But as he looked out at a ballroom full of people committed to change, he felt something he didn't often allow himself to feel. Hope. Not naive hope that everything would magically get better, but the hard-won hope that came from watching systems shift, seeing people grow, documenting progress measured not in grand gestures but in incremental improvements that accumulated over time. One flight attendant confronting her biases, one airline implementing reforms, one data set revealing patterns that couldn't be ignored. One person at a time choosing accountability over defensiveness. One system at a time being forced to change. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was movement. And movement, Evan had learned, was everything. Because the alternative was accepting that Seat 3A would always be a battleground, that passengers like him would always have to prove they belonged, that bias was just the cost of existing in spaces that weren't designed for people who looked like them. And Evan refused to accept that. So he gathered his notes, checked the time, and headed to his next meeting. Another company, another audit, another opportunity to document the gap between what organizations claimed and what they actually delivered. The work was exhausting, but it was also essential, and as long as systems perpetuated bias, as long as assumptions shaped outcomes, as long as people like him had to fight for basic dignity, Evan Carter would keep fighting. One audit at a time, one data point at a time, one moment of accountability at a time. Until the day when a black man in a hoodie could board a plane, take his seat in first class, and be met with nothing more than a simple, respectful, "Welcome aboard." That day hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming, and Evan would be there to see it.